this new bill, the AB 1867, was signed by the governor, and it takes effect immediately. The bill applies to non-food sector and food sector workers. The bill is drafted was very similar to the executive order that the governor signed back in April that applied to food sector workers. And this new bill basically codifies that food sector workers executive order and expands the supplemental paid sick leave requirement to apply to non-food sector workers as well. So for the non-food sector employers, I'll cover that first. The covered employers, it's any employer with 500 or more employees in the U.S. And it also applies to healthcare providers and emergency responders with fewer than 500 employees if they've been excluded by the employer from any coverage under the FFCRA. The covered employees, it's covering any workers who must leave their home to complete work for the employer. So it doesn't apply to anybody that is currently working at home. And as I mentioned, I'll discuss the food sector employees here in a little bit as well. So the effective date was when the governor signed the bill, September 19th, 2020. For food sector employees, the law is retroactive going back to the date the governor signed the executive order on April 16th, 2020. The expiration date is December 31st, 2020, or upon the expiration of the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And that's part of the FFCRA, the federal paid sick leave law, if it's extended past December 31st, 2020, if that portion of the FFCRA is extended past December 31st, 2020.
And this is kind of a big change because the executive order, as you recall, it was set to expire whenever the state of emergency ended, and California's state of emergencies can have a way of going on for an extended period of time. So this one provides a little more certainty as to when this paid sick leave will expire.
Yep. No, that's a good point. And I do have an asterisk on that date too. Under the new law, if an employee is taking the supplemental paid sick leave, the California supplemental paid sick leave, when the law expires, they're entitled to finish off the leave that they have under the law until they're done and can return to work. So you still might have to provide some leave if the employee started to leave prior to the expiration date. Now, this slide, I've got the covered reasons for paid leave. The supplemental paid sick leave kicks in when the worker is unable to work for any of these following reasons. 1, the worker is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. 2, the worker is advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine or self-isolate due to concerns related to COVID-19. And 3, the covered worker is prohibited from working by the covered worker's hiring entity due to health concerns related to the potential transmission of COVID-19. So it's only these 3 reasons. It's different than the 6 that we're seeing under the FFCRA, and then the various reasons from the local paid sick leave requirements that we're seeing throughout California as well. So these are the only 3 covered reasons for the paid sick leave under California supplemental paid sick leave. Now, the amount of paid leave for full-time employees, it's 80 hours. Now, part-time employees, if they have a fixed schedule, it's based on the total number of hours that are normally scheduled to work over 2 weeks. And then for part-time employees that have variable schedule, there's some math involved. It's 14 times the average number of hours worked each day in the last 6 months. And there's another exception too, if they haven't worked 6 months yet, how to do that calculation. So employers should take a look at that to calculate the amount of paid sick leave. There is a cap similar to the FFCRA. The cap on the paid leave caps out at a total of $511 per day and $5,110 in the aggregate for a covered worker. The law does permit the employer to take credit towards a supplemental paid sick leave if the employer provided paid leave for the same COVID-19 covered reasons, those 3 reasons I just discussed, and it was previously paid at the same or greater amount required under this law. So employers that have been doing paid sick leave voluntarily can get a credit towards this 80 hours if they've provided sick leave for those reasons and it was at the rate required under this law.
And if they've been responsible to provide the paid sick leave under the executive order, the employee doesn't get another 80 hours. That time would be credited to the employer as well.
Correct, for the food service workers, yep. So it's a little vague, the law. We've been looking at that issue for some clients about, and the law also says if the employer paid less than what's required under this law, they can do a catch-up retroactive payment. It's very tricky. We were looking at some guidance from the DIR's FAQs. I actually have a link to those on this slide. It's a little vague at this point, so we're still waiting for some additional clarification on that. But definitely employers need to approach that with caution and think about that before they go through that process. Now, the question we're getting a lot too, can an employer require documentation from an employee before paying the supplemental paid sick leave? The DIR's FAQ set out that employers may not require certification from a healthcare provider before allowing the worker to take the paid sick leave. It's FAQ number 6 set out in this link. Those FAQs are actually very helpful, so I recommend employers taking a look at those. The example they have there is if the employer has knowledge that an employee has been out of their house despite informing the employer that they've been ordered to self-quarantine at home, and then they've been seen at a store or at a park, then the employer can ask for that documentation. But absent any affirmative knowledge that the employee is not being honest about it or violating some other order, the employer can't condition any documentation in order for the employee to take that leave. Now, the big issue here too, for non-food sector employers, they have to list the supplemental paid sick leave on the employee's pay stub, and it's starting the next full pay period after September 9th, 2020. So it's a big development. Employers need to get on this. If they haven't gotten on it already, they need to be on it and list the supplemental paid sick leave on the pay stub, or you could also do a supplemental, different writing that's given to the employee at the pay period that lists how much they have they're eligible to use for the supplemental paid sick leave, and provide that to them on a writing at the same time they're given their paychecks. Employers are required to retain these records for at least 3 years as well. Now, for the food sector employers, again, the new law codifies the executive order, the N5120, that was signed on April 16, 2020. So a lot of the food sector employers that are on the webinar are pretty familiar with this. We've been talking about it on some prior webinars. I've set out in this small print on this slide what a food sector workers, who that applies to, and it's very specific under the different wage orders, so you need to review that carefully. We've also gotten some guidance from the Labor Commissioner's office that interpreted the executive order that the governor signed back in April. It said this food sector employers would apply to grocery workers, restaurant or fast food workers, workers at warehouses where food is stored, and workers who picked up or deliver any food items. It's safe to assume that same definition or same opinion is going to apply for this new law, the AB 1867. Now, the food sector employers, basically the same. It's very similar to the non-food sector employers that I just discussed. Same qualifying reasons for the leave. The food sector employers law, this provision under AB 1867, does apply to independent contractors. The same amounts and caps of leave as non-food sector employers applies, and we also have the same expiration date as the non-food sector employers. Now, the employers, as Mike mentioned, can take the credit for leave already provided under Executive Order N5120. So if you're a food sector employer and you've already been providing this leave under that executive order, you don't have to re-up that amount and restart that amount going forward. And the food sector employers don't have a requirement to list the amounts of paid sick leave available on the pay stubs. So it's a little different than the non-food sector employers. But I would approach that with caution, and if you can track that and provide that notice to the employees, I think it's safer to do that than not. Getting through this pretty quickly here. I know we got a lot else to get to, but this is a pretty big development. The required posters, I've got links here for the non-food sector workers and the food sector workers for the required posters. The food sector workers poster has been updated, and the labor commissioner is saying that the food sector employers need to post this new poster. So if you've been posting the old poster going back to April, I think it was published in April, you need to update that poster and post this new poster. And the link is here on this slide. And they've said for employers that don't have workers that don't visit the workplace frequently can use the electronic means to distribute the posters. Now, the final aspect of this bill that I want to talk about is a hand washing requirement. It requires all food employees working in any food facility as defined by the Health and Safety Code shall be permitted to wash their hands every 30 minutes and additionally as needed. So this portion of the bill will not expire with the rest of the bill at the end of the year, so this is permanent. I do recommend food sector workers and employers to update their policies on this provision as well going forward.